Chapter 11. Disturbing Rumors. Mrs. Zinn rushed to her husband's side and grabbed his hands. "Papa, your asthma will return if you get so mad," she said. "These girls cannot be thieves. They are nice people. They are trying to help you." The irate antique dealer looked impatiently at his wife, then glared at Nancy. "I found my stolen lamps hidden under a blanket by the back seat of your car. How can you explain that?" Nancy tried not to raise her voice, although she too was becoming angry. "Did the woman who called you give her name?" she asked. Mr. Zinn admitted that she had not, but the woman had told such a convincing story of seeing Nancy secreting the lamps that he had believed her. Finding the evidence in the convertible had convinced him that Nancy was guilty. Nancy was stunned by the accusation. "I'm sure this is Roger Holt's work," she declared. "He got his wife to make the call. He has been trying in various ways to keep me from working on the case. It started while I was still in River Heights." "Yes," George broke in. "If this whole idea about Nancy stealing lamps was not utterly foolish, I'd call our chief of police in River Heights and have him tell you a few things." Bess added indignantly, "If you only knew all the wonderful things Nancy has done in her life, you wouldn't dare say these things about her." With his wife and the 3 girls against him, Mr. Zinn calmed down a little. Finally, he said he would not call the police because he now had the lamps. But he said firmly that he wanted the girls to leave the premises immediately. "That suits me," said George. "If we had taken your old lamps, don't you think we'd have left long before this?" Mrs. Zinn looked as though she wanted to cry. She had become fond of the girls and did not want them to leave her house with ill feelings toward her husband. Once more, the kindly woman tried to reason with him, but the man was adamant. "We can solve our own mysteries," he told her. "There may be something to this witch business after all. There are all types of witches." Nancy's eyes flashed. This insult was too much. She said goodbye to Mrs. Zinn, turned on her heel, and walked away. Bess and George followed. The girls drove off without a backward look. Their feelings were mixed. Roger Holt and his wife had played a clever trick this time in accusing Nancy of being a thief. Besides, she was becoming more unpopular by the moment in the Amish neighborhood. Soon, no one would be willing to speak to the young detective or trust her. "Well, at least you didn't go to jail," said George. Then, trying to bring a little humor into the situation, she said, "We all look like witches sometimes, especially after we've washed our hair. Particularly me." Nancy suddenly grinned and said, "I have an old witch Halloween costume at home. Maybe I should have brought it along." But Bess could see no humor in their predicament. She was afraid that if Mr. Zinn spread the lamp story, and she would not put it past him to do so, the girls might even be asked to leave the county. "By the time we return to the Glicks, they may freeze up too and turn us out," she prophesied dolefully. It was with some apprehension that the girls drove up the lane leading to the Glick farmhouse. Becky and Henner rushed out the kitchen door to meet them. Before the girls could even step from the convertible, Henner called out, "You be witches, ain't?" Nancy stepped to the ground and, kneeling, put her arms around the little boy. Quietly but firmly, she told him that she and her friends were not witches. "Pinch me and see," she suggested. "I'm just as real as you are." "But, Mama, she went to a schnitzing," Henner told her. "The women, they say you all be witches." At this moment, Mrs. Glick ran from the house. Having overheard her son's remark, she scolded him, saying, "I told you, Henner, that witches are only make-believe. You are a bad boy for repeating what I told your papa those silly women said. Go help him now." Mrs. Glick turned to the three girls as her children ran off. "My friends are not really foolish," she said, "but some of them are superstitious. They believe strange stories. They forget that witches are nothing but old wives' tales." She smiled in a friendly way, and the girls felt relieved. They all went into the house, and Nancy excused herself to freshen up for supper. While washing her face and hands, she reviewed her problem. The girl detective was sure that Roger Holt and his wife were spreading the propaganda which was making her unpopular with the Amish people. But how to cope with it was a big question. Just then, she heard a car coming up the farmhouse lane. Peering from her bedroom window, Nancy saw that it had stopped at the kitchen entrance. A uniformed state trooper got out and knocked loudly on the door. A few moments later, Mrs. Glick called up the stairway. "Nancy, will you come downstairs, please?" Nancy fairly flew to the first floor, hoping that the trooper had some news of Roger Holt and his wife. Perhaps they had been apprehended. Mrs. Glick introduced her to the officer, a freckle-faced, outdoor-type man. "How do you do?" The officer acknowledged the introduction. "Well, you certainly don't look much like a witch." Nancy was thunderstruck. Did the police in this area believe the foolish rumors too, or was he joking? Before she could reply, however, the trooper grinned. He explained that earlier in the day a call had been received at police headquarters. An unidentified woman had said that 3 out-of-state girls were stirring up trouble among neighborhood families. The girls, she had said, were witches, and one in particular, named Nancy Drew, had claimed she had supernatural powers to locate missing persons and solve mysteries. "Well, I never," said Mrs. Glick. The trooper smiled. "It's all nonsense, of course. But our practice is to investigate anonymous calls whenever possible. I traced you here to the Glicks. How about it, Miss Drew? Can you clear this up?" Nancy told the officer everything that had happened so far, and for the first time, Mrs. Glick heard the story of the hex sign with the words witch tree symbol under it. The woman blinked in amazement. Continuing, the girl detective admitted to having solved several mysteries, but said that she was only an amateur and laid no claim to being an expert. She added that she had in no way tried to create trouble in the neighborhood. At this moment, George, who had been listening on the stairway, came down and corroborated Nancy's story. Then she asked about Roger Holt and was told that he had not been apprehended. The officer said that the police would do their best to stop the witch rumor and added, "Good luck, Nancy Drew. Let's hope you or the police find this suspect, Roger Holt, pretty soon." With a smile, he turned toward the door and left. Nancy dropped into a nearby chair. "This is getting worse and worse," she said. "That man Holt is really dangerous." Mrs. Glick came to Nancy's side and laid a motherly hand on her shoulder. "We will not talk about this anymore. Tomorrow you are going to forget the mystery and have a good time. It is market day. Would you girls like to help me stand market?" "Oh, we'd love to," cried Nancy, her face brightening. "What can we do for you, Mrs. Glick?" The farm woman said that the vegetables had to be picked after sundown, washed, and arranged attractively that evening for market. "Then early tomorrow morning we will bake bread and make pies and cakes to sell," she told Nancy. The family and their visitors had an early supper. Then Mrs. Glick and all the girls went into the mathematically precise garden and began picking plump carrots and beets. When their baskets were full, Nancy and the cousins carried them to the sluiceway for washing. Next, they were sorted into sizes, cleaned, then tied into bunches with straw strings. Meanwhile, Mrs. Glick and Becky were picking other vegetables. By bedtime, all the produce was ready to be taken to town the next morning. The girls, tired from the long day, quickly tumbled into bed. It seemed they had hardly fallen asleep when Mrs. Glick knocked on their doors. "It is 4 o'clock. Time to get up," she called to them. In answer, Bess opened one eye and looked around the dark room, then dived deeper under the covers. George gave a tremendous yawn, turned on to her other side, and went back to sleep. Nancy did not even wake up. After a while, a louder knock came on the doors. This time, Mrs. Glick said nothing until the girls answered. Then she called, "Girls, it's 4:30. If you're going to help me, you must get up now." The girls jumped out of bed, hurried into their clothes, and raced downstairs. They found Mrs. Glick, with Becky's help, busy with her baking. On a side table stood several boxes of cookies. From the oven came the aroma of apple pie. "You are sleepy birds," Mrs. Glick teased, while stirring batter for a cake. "But you are in time to make the Fasnacht." The hot fat was ready for the willing helpers. One by one, Nancy and George dropped the batter of donut rings into it. As soon as each one was cooked, it was removed, dried on paper, and sprinkled with powdered sugar by Bess. "When you get hungry, help yourselves," Mrs. Glick invited. "We will not have time this morning to sit down to breakfast." The girls waited until they had finished frying the donuts. Then they helped themselves to huge slices of buttered bread on which they heaped apple butter. The meal was topped off with Fasnacht. "We'll leave at 6 sharp," Mrs. Glick announced, as she bustled about the homey kitchen. As the clock was striking that hour, the last of the food was being packed into the Glicks' automobile. Then the farm woman, Nancy, Bess, and George got in and started for town. When they reached the market, the girls helped Mrs. Glick carry her produce to the stall that had been assigned to her. After it was attractively set up, the woman suggested that the girls walk through the market, then look around the town. "Market day is a big one here," she said. "Many of the people do not come to town at any other time. Everyone always enjoys it." The girls were intrigued not only by the hearty, appetizing foods and the bright flowers on display, but also by the stalls where hand needlework and cookbooks were on sale. The visitors each bought a book and a colorful apron to take home. "The plainer the people, the fancier their decorations," Bess commented. Outside the market, Nancy and her friends watched Amish carriage after carriage arrive. There was a long row of hitching posts, to which the horses were tied side by side. There was not a black horse among them. "I guess Holt wouldn't dare show up in this crowd," George remarked. Most of the men and women were tall and strong-looking. All had good color and bright eyes. George suddenly grinned. "The minute they turn their backs, you can't tell one from another." Bess giggled. "I should think young men would have a hard time keeping track of their dates." An hour later, the girls decided to return to the market to see how Mrs. Glick was getting along. As they turned the corner, they saw an Amish girl coming toward them. Suddenly, Nancy cried out, "Why, Manda Kreutz!" End of Chapter 11.